All right, hi everyone. Thank you so much for watching this video and thanks for being here, for all of you that are here on this panel. In this video, we're going to talk just a little bit about the creative writing program at LaGuardia Community College. I'm Dr. Sonia Alejandra Rodriguez, and I'm the current program director in the English department for creative writing. The creative writing program offers several creative writing classes, such as an ENN 198, Introduction to Creative Writing, ENG 271, Poetry Writing, ENG 274, Creative Nonfiction Workshop, and ENG 276, the Fiction Writing Workshop. So I'm here with fellow creative writing faculty, and we're going to talk about writing, and we're going to talk about our classes. And should you have any questions, viewers, audience, students, about our classes, you can always just contact me. All right, so the first question is for anyone who wants to answer. Well, tell me who you are, or tell us who you are in this virtual space. Who are you and why you write? And maybe I'll go with Bethany since I see her first.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Professor Bethany Holmstrom for all of you watching. I teach Intro to Creative Writing and I teach the Lit internship. I write, good question. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it. So Professor Rodriguez sent us these questions in advance, and I think I've always really liked characters and stories generally, which I know is very vague. I mean, it's kind of a compelling, basic human need to want to read and tell stories. But I always grew up writing, but thought that writing wasn't something that you could do for your life unless you were like an independently wealthy rich kid with a trust fund. I did not think that that was an option for me to just do as a person. It just didn't seem viable. So I didn't really pursue it for a really long time until I kind of got to a space in my life where I was like, you can just do this. You don't have to have, you know, it's just something you can do with your life and in your life. It doesn't have to be, you know, it won't be your central identity maybe, but it's there. And so I think I pushed it aside for a long time. But, you know, the idea of interacting with characters and with stories for so long and wanting to be part of that conversation as a writer and to kind of immerse myself in other worlds or create other worlds has been there. It's just, you know, at some point you have to decide you kind of want to do it. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Anyone else want to jump in, or do you want me to call folks? Okay, I'll call folks. Professor Tanenbaum.
Hi, my name is Laura Tanenbaum, and I teach creative nonfiction and intro to creative writing here at LaGuardia. And for why I write, I think the reason I started writing was when I was young. So my family is mostly made up of scientists and mathematicians. And so I was very much trained in there's a right answer for everything. And I got into a lot of arguments with my family trying to say that like my different opinions were okay. And I wanted to sort of figure out like how people worked, because that seemed really mysterious to me. For a while, I wanted to be a therapist because I thought like people would tell me their secrets, and then I decided that would actually be really overwhelming and terrible. So I figured writing was a way to sort of figure out how people think and figure out how I thought, but then also I wasn't responsible for solving other people's problems. So that's kind of why I got started. And as I've gotten older, I think a lot of it now has to do with memory, not just of my own experiences, but you know, experiences of family members who aren't around anymore, or just things that I read or issues that I really care about, and that it's harder to kind of hold on to those things as you get older. So it's important for me to record that in a way. And yeah, so that's a little bit about me.
Awesome, thank you. Professor Conners.
Hi everyone, I'm Carrie Conners and I teach the Intro to Creative Writing, ENN 198 and ENG 271, the poetry workshop. Most frequently on the literature side of things too, I teach the 270, the Intro to Poetry as well, and I think that that course is also very useful, right, for studying creative writing, and I think it has a lot of connections with our creative writing courses. I'm teaching that this semester, and it's a lot of fun. So why I write, I think I've always been fascinated with the way people talk. I come from a family of storytellers, talkers, bullshitters, let's be real, like and so but I was immersed in that kind of environment, and I always have been fascinated with that, and I've lived in a few different places around the country, and I just have always had an ear for the different regionalisms and phrases that people have. But I started writing when I was really young, and I especially fell in love with poetry, and narrative poetry, especially telling stories. Like Laura, I was a kind of a math and science geek growing up, but I was always like writing poems in my calculus classes and just like, always sneaking it in there. But I decided in college to start to pursue writing, because although I loved and still love math, I just found such passion and meaning in the study of creative writing and poetry, and it just felt like a calling, it felt like a love, so not just an interest, but something that felt like a little deeper to me. But I think that, like others were saying too, the importance of memory, and kind of I think that writing now, as Laura was saying, getting older, it does kind of keep me connected to my past. When I write about family, write about where I'm from. I'm not from New York. I'm from West Virginia originally, and I kind of feel like a lot of my writing keeps me connected to those places that I've lived in the past, and to my home and to my family, and I just feel like it allows me to feel connected to other people through, especially, incorporating people's speech into my work, and I feel like I write a lot about people's working lives and people's lives that way, and I kind of feel it keeps me connected in the sense of being empathetic, or sympathetic about what people's experiences are, and so that's a lot, I think. So I'll stop.
That's awesome. Thank you. Professor Clark?
Hey everybody, I'm Liz Clark, delighted to be here. I teach the Introduction to Creative Writing course and also the fiction workshop. So I started out my career as a writer as a poet. I focused entirely on poetry in my undergraduate and graduate career. And a lot of why I wrote actually is what Carrie was saying, was really about family and memory and trying to make sense of the world through poetry. I come from a family that has a mixed family of kids, and two of the children in our family, my brother and sister, are adopted and came to our family through the AIDS pandemic. So I did a lot of writing early on, really about trying to understand the role of poetry as political poetry to bear witness to a pandemic. Find that kind of ironic as we're right now going through COVID, and I'm not writing poetry about COVID, although I know many of the folks on this panel are grappling with that right now, and how to put that into words. But so I started out writing, really trying to make sense of my place in the family, my place in the AIDS pandemic, and trying to really understand poetry as a political tool to voice what was going on around me. More recently, I've morphed into fiction. And fiction is kind of at the other end. So I write fiction for children. I also do science nonfiction writing for kids. And my fiction is entirely focused on how can I imagine a different world? And how can I invite kids into that world and to thinking about how we can make a better world? So I do a lot of speculative writing and thinking about alternative worlds. Yeah, so that's it.
Awesome. These are all excellent answers. I'll fill mine in and then we'll jump on to the next one. So I am from Chicago. I feel like just like Carrie, I always want to say like, I'm not from New York. I'm from Chicago by way of Mexico. I was born in Juarez, Mexico, and I grew up in Chicago, Illinois. Just as like everyone else has mentioned, I think a lot of my experiences and what led me to writing had a lot to do with what was happening in my community, what was happening to my family. And I think it was also just a way for me to try to figure out like answers to understand, maybe very similar to like Professor Tanenbaum, like I needed to figure out why are people like this? What is happening? I think it was like, it was like a calling. And I think I was just trying to figure out like the trauma that was happening in my life. I felt like I was a very rational child. And I was like, there needs to be an answer. Like I need an answer for why this is happening, because in my head, it didn't make sense, right? And I think I didn't start making a sense of my world until I went to college and started learning about like Latinx history and like Latinx sociology and literature. And so finding other people that looked like me in books is really what guided me to writing. I read Sandra Cisneros' The House on Mango Street for the first time as a freshman in college. And if you're not familiar with the book, it's about a young Mexican woman, 15-year-old girl in Chicago. And I was like, is Sandra Cisneros following me around, just writing down my life? Because I could really relate to what the main character was going through. It was also the first time that I like kind of connected that like people like me could write books, that like we could put words down on paper and like other people could read it too. But very similarly to like the other panelists, I didn't really start pursuing creative writing until I finished my doctorate degree. I was doing a lot of creative nonfiction, again, just trying to figure out what was happening in the world and my place in it. But I didn't really become a fiction writer until, or own that I was a fiction writer until I finished my doctoral degree. And since then, I've just been very dedicated to crafting and working on my craft as a fiction writer. And I think like all of us have said, right, it's me just trying to understand the world, trying to imagine different possibilities and create space, right, for myself and for others like me. Okay, so my next question, and a lot of you have already kind of tapped into this question, but the main question for this year's National Day on Writing is, how does writing keep you connected? And so you can think about it in terms of your own creative writing and what you do in your classrooms, in your personal life, right? You can think of writing just broadly. So I'll go ahead and start there. How does writing keep you connected? And we'll start again with Professor Holmstrom.
So for me, writing keeps me connected, which is interesting because sometimes if you think about it, writing can be a very solitary endeavor anyway. But I feel like within this pandemic, it sometimes has, I don't want to say it's been a creative outlet to kind of, I don't know how something where it's like I can go and create something, but somehow that tethers me back to reality. It's not an escapist thing for me, I find. It's very much, I've noticed in ways in the fiction I've been writing now that kind of references, even if it's not directly engaging with COVID in any way, a lot of the things that I've seen coming up during this pandemic kind of have been working its way into my fiction around questions about access to healthcare and, you know, larger issues around equality and this sort of thing, which have always been in my writing, but I think are happening in new ways. But especially with my students and with other writers, I'm finding we're still finding spaces to talk, to come together, to write, even in this. And sometimes it's easier to have a Zoom to get together and do a writing workshop or writing than it was to get everybody together in person. So we're finding new ways of connecting and exchanging our work that I also find very promising, both with students and with other writers I know. But I think just finding those exchanges and making sure they continue to happen has been a good way to keep me connected to different writing communities throughout this.
Awesome, thank you. We'll jump to Professor Tanenbaum, please.
Thank you so much. It's a great question. I've been thinking about it a lot. So I have sort of two parts. One is about sort of being connected to the world and political consciousness, and then the other about memory. So with a couple of you have mentioned, you know, writing as a political act, which is, I think, one thing I love about like our program is that we all sort of, I don't speak, I think everyone has some sense of that possibility, you know? And so, you know, I've always been a political person. I've always, just like other people have been saying, like part of trying to figure out why the world is the way it is like, just why is there so much unneeded suffering, you know, like, and so I've always had that, and writing has always been a way of figuring that out, especially some of my creative nonfiction is sort of, you know, is essays on feminist history and book reviews. So it's more sort of directly political. But what's been interesting for me during the pandemic, I think, is that writing, and especially poetry, I found poetry really suits the pandemic mood, because there's so much great poetry about grief and death, and it's also like short, you know, for those little short moments of time we're all trying to carve out. But it's been very interesting. I think the part of the way poetry has helped me be connected during the pandemic especially is just, I'll always be a political person, but poetry reminds me that like there's more to the world than like the latest stupid shit on Twitter, you know, like that we all care about the world, but we also, you know, so that like reading Adrienne Rich's poetry, which has meant a lot to me, like where she deals like with, you know, political darkness and like, you know, her family's experience with fascism and how that, you know, shaped her life. And that, you know, just that idea that other people have gone through really terrible times and how they made sense of it has been one way that I've been trying to stay connected. And then just on the more like micro level, you know, memory, as I get older, since my mother died, you know, she's like changed in terms of not just recording memories with her, but almost like writing to her, you know, as a way of staying connected to that memory. And then also having very small kids. And I don't know if we have, I know actually from my class, I do have some, we have some majors who are children. So if people say that you can't have kids and find time to write, don't listen to them. You can do it if it counts. Everything, if it matters, you can do it. But just, you know, it's the biggest cliche in the world, but just like that, the just fast changing that they go through and trying to like grab onto these little snippets of time. So there's a great poem called One Boy Told Me, that's a found poem by Naomi Shabib-Nye, I think is how you say it. And she, which just, you know, things that her kids said at a certain age, you know, so I always just think of that as like, you know, one way of writing, keep us connected, is just these little snippets, right, that would just shoot out through our fingers unless there was some little basket to put them in. So that's it.
Awesome, thank you so much for that. Professor Conners?
So yeah, like everyone, I've been thinking about this question too, and it is such a great, complex question. And I spoke a little bit about memory and kind of writing helping me to keep connected to places and people in other, you know, states and other places. But I also think with the pandemic, you know, we haven't been able to travel, right? We haven't been able to see a lot of people that we care about and we love. And I found myself writing more and more about those people who I wish I could be with and I wish I could see. And I workshop poetry with Laura Tanenbaum, with Professor Tanenbaum, and so she knows this, but I've been writing a lot about my best friend who is in California, right? So the other, so, yeah. But she's in the other part of the, you know, the other side of the country, and I can't see her. And then we also write letters to one another often. So I've actually been incorporating some of like those letters and the ridiculous into some poems. But so just kind of feeling like I'm staying connected by really thinking about those people that I care about that I can't see. And so even though we are isolated from one another, that writing kind of helps me feel like they are with me. I'm still, connected to them. And I think that's really powerful. I also, picking up on the political things or the sort of political nature of writing, I think that's so important. And I know I have been taking solace and kind of finding connection by reading a lot of poetry and fiction, but of others. And I just kind of keep returning to the Audre Lorde poem, Coping, which I know we used for the collective translation event a few years ago at LaGuardia. But just there is it's a beautiful poem. It's a short poem, and we talked about our attention spans, right, or also our time being compressed. But it's lovely. But it really describes grief and pain. But then there is hope at the end, and I kind of keep returning to that poem, right? Because it gives you a sense that even if the world is a certain way at a particular time, there is a possibility for change. And I think that that writing can also kind of keep you connected to different perspectives, because I think sometimes when we feel like stuck in a moment, but writing can kind of show us that there are other possibilities and kind of remind us about the power of change.
Definitely, that's awesome. Thank you. Professor Clark?
So unlike Professor Tanenbaum and Professor Conners, I was not in any way, shape, or form a gifted math and science student in K through 12. Although I am incredibly interested in the world of science, it did not translate into excellence in the classroom, shall we say. So one of the ways that writing keeps me connected is it really allows me to explore ideas and concepts that maybe in a traditional classroom setting, I didn't score 100 on. So I'm doing a lot of writing about climate change, and writing about climate change and the ocean has given me a lot of opportunities to do field research by diving and working with different conservation groups and thinking about how climate change is affecting the ocean. So one of the things I really love about writing and how writing keeps us connected is it changes over time. So earlier in my writing career, writing kept me connected to memory, to family, to finding my place in the world, to other people, to telling stories about my family. And now I feel like it's really keeping me connected very solidly to the world of science and finding connections between the arts and the sciences, which I think are so critical. We're so often put into silos, like you're either a science person or you're an art person. And I think that has been a real detriment to our society. So I love the way that writing allows me to connect all of those worlds and to explore them.
Awesome, thanks so much. I'll speak a little bit about how I feel like writing keeps me connected. I'll echo Professor Holmstrom that I feel like I've taken a lot of workshops on Zoom since the pandemic, and I think one that speaks to how a lot more things need to be made accessible in different ways. And I think as the pandemic has progressed, there's been fewer and fewer of those workshops because folks seem to be burnt out from Zoom University and just everything is overwhelming, right? But I like to think of my writing as connecting me, and folks have been saying this in terms of memory. I've been really invested or really like intrigued by figuring out my family's history. And I like to say that it's because, well, it's not just me, right? Like the reason, like genocide has like really like, and colonialism and imperialism has really taken like my culture away from me. Right, from my ancestors, and so now here I am trying to figure out like who we are and who we were and what languages we spoke, what stories we told, and so I've really been just speaking with my family about like trying to go as far back as possible. And one of the ways that I've found myself staying connected is by dropping my ancestors' names in my stories, right, and creating new stories for us just because I feel that I don't necessarily have all of the tools right now or all of the information to uncover my family history, but the least I could do is keep repeating like the names over and over and jotting them down, right, as a way to create like a personal archive that these were like the women, particularly like the women in my lineage. I think writing also has helped me stay connected to my students, whether they like it or not, right? We're all taking composition courses and they're in classes with me and they have to write a lot. I make them write a lot and they're like, Jesus, why are you writing so much? And I think particularly with composition, it's a very basic form of communication, right? It's not the only way of communicating, right? As I mentioned, right, genocide, colonialism, imperialism has like taken away like a lot of our forms of communication, but at this moment, like writing is one of the essential ways that we communicate with one another, right? And I want them to be able to leave with those tools to be able to express themselves, right? And so I think that's one of the ways that I work to make sure that I'm connected globally, locally to my family, but also give my students the tools to connect themselves to other spaces. So that was awesome. So my next question is, I really want to get to know more, or I want our audience, our virtual audience, to know more about who you are as a professor in the classroom. I think as creative writing faculty, we have this very unique position of like uniting like our creative writing world and our like teaching pedagogy. And so I think what happens in creative writing classrooms is very magical. And from my personal experience, it feels very much different than what I do in my comp or lit classes. We'll go around again, very broad, vague question, like what does your classroom look like? And you can speak about multiple classes or one class in particular. I just want to give our students, our virtual audience, an idea of what creative writing courses at LaGuardia look like. So we'll start with Professor Holmstrom. I'm having a hard time hearing you. Yeah. We'll move on to Professor Tanenbaum and we'll come back to you.
Hi. It's interesting. I noticed a lot of us have worked with a lot of different genres and moved between different genres, which I think is a normal. And I've sort of had an opposite trajectory from Liz. I had, written and published short stories, and then they started getting shorter. And I was like, oh, they're flash fiction. And they started getting shorter. And I'm like, they're a prose poem. So what I think is really cool is that we have the 198, where you can kind of explore all those, genres. And then we have our other classes. So I've been teaching most recently the creative nonfiction and 198. And I guess what I would just say about my creative writing classroom is that, I always think of it as like, learning an instrument or learning another language or exercising, which are like all things that I've failed repeatedly to do, but I like to think I would be able to do, but that it's really, really a matter of practice and not like knowledge. So that I really like to think of my class as just a place where we get together and do the thing, and then we kind of go off and do it some more together, and then we come back together and talk about how it was. We do a lot of in-class writing, and I am teaching right now for the online classes. I'm doing it as a hybrid of synchronous and unsynchronous. So we do have some time together where even on Zoom, we come together and do a little writing exercise and then go off and come back. And so I think, people, it's flexible with the time, that if you absolutely can't do the live, you can have other ways, but it's just useful to relate it to what people were just saying as a way for us to try to connect and all kind of do the work together. In my classes, we do a lot of sort of short in-class exercises. Some of them turn into bigger projects. Some of them just like exist and live on their own. And then, maybe you want to come back to them. In my Intro to Creative Writing class, I do a lot with writing in the city, and in normal times that involves sort of like field work going around the city. So I'm curious I'll be reworking that class for pandemic times to think about how we can still sort of be experiential, right? And take our environment into account, even as our environment has been shrinking. The other thing I really love about creative writing is how we read literary texts, but in a different way from in the literature classes, so that you know, whether we're working with The Colossus of New York is a book I love teaching that is all about different descriptions of New York places. There is a collection of essays by Colston Whitehead, and that, you know, you can do the things you would do in a literature class of like identify this is what he's doing or analyze it, but that you're sort of approaching it from this point of view of like, oh, could I do that? You know, and like sometimes people do pieces where they're really, you know, like almost doing an imitation, and sometimes it's just like one little thing that they sort of take from it. So yeah, so we spend a lot of time, you know, reading, but hopefully reading in a way where we're sort of reading with the author and then writing with them, as well as just like reading them in order to say something back. So yeah.
Awesome, that sounds exciting. Thank you. We'll check in with Professor Holmstrom. Back to you, see if that works. We'll move on, we'll come back, try again. Professor Conners?
Hi, thanks. So kind of building off of what Professor Tanenbaum was saying, there are, I do a lot of, shorter exercises, writing exercises in class, but I always kind of like to think of it as like productive play. Like I feel like we do lots of experiments and kind of play around with language and just try things on in a way, and just see what happens, right? So I kind of feel like in the classroom, it's more about playing around with language, kind of pushing yourself to write in ways that maybe you have never done before, and just seeing what sticks. And I know, like, when I was in undergrad, I took my first creative writing workshop, and just reading different authors with different styles, and then I was assigned to write like an imitation of one of the writers, and I had never written a prose poem before, and then all of a sudden I just like fell in love with prose poems, and just that's all I could write. And so I just think that, you know, as you're developing a voice, it's so great to be exposed to different styles and to play around with language, right? Because you kind of never know your limits as a writer, and your voice can morph and change. And so I think that you know, productive play or playing around, experimenting is really useful as a writer. And a lot of times, we translate those exercises from class into more composed pieces. And then in my classes, we do workshop, and this is whether we're in the, you know, the actual classroom or the virtual classroom. And I love doing workshop in creative writing, whether it's the intro class, the 198, or in poetry workshop in 271, because I think that one of the most magical, to use Sonia's word, one of the most magical things that can happen in a creative writing classroom is to see students, to see writers get inspired by each other. And it happens every single time there's workshop, and people just, their eyes open, right? They are just awakened to different possibilities, and then they want to maybe try to write like that, or to push themselves to write something different, or, you know, it's just, that's one of the most magical things, I think, is to find that community of writers that inspires one another. And it's just probably my favorite thing about teaching creative writing, is just seeing the students, seeing writers inspire one another, and I get inspired too. And so I know I have left class or workshop so many times with like goosebumps, and just like wanting to write something of my own, because I've been so inspired by the LaGuardia student writers. It's, yeah, so that's the most magical thing for me.
Cool, thanks for sharing. We'll try again with Professor Holmstrom. Back to you. I feel like a reporter.
I know. Is it working this time? Yay! Okay, my old crappy computer decides to work. Yay! So for me, 198 is a lot about I use a lot of Franny Choi's poetry, and talk about and a lot of her poetry is thinking a lot about layers of identity and reactions to others, interpreting us in certain ways. And so I think I encourage my students a lot to ground their experience and their particular specific experience and how that translates into writing, whether we use some of that in a kind of fiction sort of setting or if it's in poetry. And so I think that that informs a lot of what I do. And so I have us read a lot of things that, you know, where the authors are really conveying things that are specific and important to them, especially in poetry, if you think about odes or you think about Franny Choi's work. And so to me, it's very much looking at intersections of identity throughout the work, but it's always in conversation with other authors, because I, of course, like I'm sure everyone here, you know, you're not going to be a good writer if you don't read and read deeply and read closely and read outside of your comfort zone as well. So we spend time annotating texts that are kind of models of different skills that we want to then deploy in our own writing, whether it's a particular form of descriptive writing, or it's using dialogue in flash fiction, or it's playing with point of view. So you get a lot of kind of different, for me, models to work with that hopefully inspire you in turn when you write. I think a lot too, because I run the Lit internship and we're publishing an online magazine, I think a lot about professionalization as writers and what that looks like. So I have students also get to write cover letters and work on portfolio submissions. It could be actual submissions to Lit journals. For the Lit, we look at a lot of digital online journals and see what's happening in the field and, you know, where we see our journal kind of responding to or fitting within that, or what we can take in terms of ideas around how journals are structured or what their mission is or what their issue looks like. So to me, that's kind of part of a, you know, professionalization as writers. And because of how I came to writing kind of late, I always want students to feel like, even if this isn't like the only thing you're doing in your life, this is still something you can always do and pursue, no matter if you're in a completely different field. And so I just kind of want to give them avenues to explore and see that too.
That's awesome. That's super important. Thank you so much. Professor Clark, please.
So I think I approach ENN 198 and Fiction Workshop pretty similarly. So the keywords I would use, well, let me back up and say that in addition to having no math and science proficiency, I also do not have a proficiency in visual art. I'm pretty much limited to stick figures, which are very exciting, but, you know, somewhat limiting if one wanted an artistic career. But I'm super jealous in non-pandemic times when we walk around the floor that has the art studios at LaGuardia, because it's just so cool, right? Like if you're an art student, you get to go into that like cool room with all the cool stuff and the windows and the light and like the paints and the markers. And I think, oh, like I really wish that I could have that. But I have no use for those things. But I like this idea of the studio, right? Like, so what art students do is they come together and they practice their craft and they look at it and they share it. And I think that studio, in the best sense of the word, is what I try to do in my writing classes. We're coming together and we're writing together, and we're all writing together as writers. So in my classes, we always, as others have said, do a lot of writing in class. Because it's really hard to try and find that space to write outside of class. People have really busy lives, and it's hard just to find a quiet space and to find a space where other things aren't competing for your attention. So I like to help make the classroom a space where that can happen. The other word that I would use for my courses is playground. We do a lot of playing. We play with form, we play with technique, we play with craft, we play with style. And I think it's really important to have a sense of play to figure out what you might like to try in your own work. So in addition to that, we also do a lot of reading. We do a lot of reading of contemporary. I tend to have us read what's actually being published. So I don't tend to teach things so much like I might in a literature class that have been published and have gotten a lot of awards. I tend to have us look at things that have just been published, often within the last year or two. So we see what's going on, what are trends, how can we understand what publishing looks like right now in the moment. So that's a lot of what goes on. And in non-pandemic times, I like to take the class places. We go places to write and be inspired. We go to hear other writers. And as others have said, as much as possible in the online world, I'm looking to see how I can replicate that.
Great, thanks so much. My courses, so I teach ENN 198, the Intro to Creative Writing, and I also teach ENG 276. So I'll speak a little bit on both. For the past few years that I've been teaching 276, the fiction workshop, the subtitle for my class has been Writing in Fucked Up Times. And it feels so, every year it's really felt like super relevant, but this year in particular just really takes the cake on what is happening. And the reason I title my class that is because I am coming from a space where like oppression, marginalization, and trash fires have happened for a very long time, particularly like for like BIPOC, right? Black, Indigenous people of color, marginalized folks in certain like different areas. And so I like to bring to the forefront like those marginalized, silenced, erased voices into my classroom that speak to the demographic of my students. Again, because as I mentioned earlier, it like was mind blowing to me to find someone that like looked like me, that had written a book, and a character that looked like me that was in a book. Like it just completely changed my mind. And so I tried to bring that into my classroom. In my fiction class, I'm also very adamant that writing is political, right? And that fiction is political. We tend to think that because it's made up, that it's not political, right? I'm not bringing in politics. I'm not talking about politics. But there's a little bit of pushback on that, right? Because I think particularly because fiction and the way that like the publishing industry and well-known writers talk about fiction, that we should be able to write about whomever, whatever, whenever, etc. that we want, right? That's the freedom that we have as creative writers. And I think that's absolutely true. But I like to remind my students that every action, decision that we make as writers is political. You picking up a pen or typing on your keyboard is a political act, right? Because if you think of how often the history, right, that has not allowed someone like you to write, right? And for you to get to that point, right, it's a political act. The kind of characters you create, who is in your story, who is speaking, how they speak, what they wear, where they are, all of that are all political decisions. And so we also read writers that are demonstrating that. I like to teach current living writers, again, so that my students can see like, these are people you can talk to on Twitter. You can find them and ask them questions, right? Like writing is happening now, present, right? It's impacting us now. And so I do a combination, my fiction class, I do a combination of books, like flash fiction books or like short story books. But I also do just share a lot of flash fiction pieces from online literary magazines so that students can see like this is accessible to you, right? If we end up working on a polished flash fiction piece, like we could submit it and this could be you in a year, right? That's how long it takes sometimes. So I like doing that in my fiction class. In my ENN 198 class, as it's been mentioned, right, that's the creative writing class where it covers different genres. And I do something very similar to what everyone has mentioned, right? I'm very interested in like the workshop aspect of these classes because I feel like it's the most vulnerable part of writing. You've put yourself on a page and then you have to have other people read it. That's really scary. Like, even though I think as writers, our goal is to have other people read our writing, I'm usually like, please don't read my writing. And so I think I really appreciate the workshop space, I think in particular in the intro to creative writing, because it's usually the first time students are sharing their creative work and they feel very vulnerable. And as Professor Connor mentions, it becomes like this very like magical, inspiring space where students are usually just like applauding one another or super impressed by what they've created. And it becomes this very like communal, like supportive, empowering space. And so I try to build that in my courses. I have one more surprise question for all of you that just came to my mind right now before we close. I want us to just leave with a message for our viewers or potentially students about why creative writing at LaGuardia, right? Why should our students take classes, become majors, hopefully graduate as a major? So why creative writing at LaGuardia? And we'll start with Professor Holmstrom.
Well, I think why creative writing at LaGuardia, in part because we have an incredibly supportive community of faculty and of student writers. And like I said, I came a little late to the game, but I've been overwhelmed by the support that's been offered to me by other faculty members, but also how eager the students are, even students who are like come into 198 saying, I've never done creative writing before, but man, they like commit to it and it's amazing. And just how it gives you a really different way of kind of talking about your experiences and writing about your experiences, but just another way of writing. Very often when we're writing especially as a student, in a totally academic context all the time and slogging through however many essays and this sort of thing, to have another outlet and see how writing can do other things for you, I think is really important. But I just think we have such a great community of so many different people from so many different backgrounds, and who are really just open and eager to share their experiences and support one another. And I think that it's a really great program. And I've been just very, very excited by working with the community.
I agree. Professor Tanenbaum?
Yeah, it's kind of builds on that, and also on what Professor Rodriguez was saying. I think that we're a really great community in terms of like, we see our mission as like building each other up and building the students up. And I think the students really pick up on that, because I know sometimes, you know, people are intimidated by going into workshop and think that there's something out there of like, some people are just creative and I'm not, or some people are born writers and I'm not. And I think we all approach it where we're not, like what can unfortunately happen in some places, right, where professors or other students think their job is to like tear you down, and if you keep coming back for more, that's how you prove you're a real writer, and that kind of crap. And I think, you know, that's just not, you know, our environment here. So I think that's a really unique thing. And then the other thing I think that is really so special about our program is, I really think that like in certain ways, like there's a lot of the, you know, exclusion and racism in publishing that Professor Rodriguez was talking about. Like, you guys are in a unique position to challenge that and to like take those jobs and those internships and publish that work that's going to make change in that. And I think you've got a great asset behind you, because even if the world of publishing is like, you know, unequal in so many ways, like talent, you know, talent really is in a way an equalizer. And I think that's why we have such great student work that gets out there, and such beautiful artwork that Professor Clark was doing, because, you know, you can go to expensive schools and get the degrees and like learn to use jargon that might pass in certain fields. But at the end of the day in writing, it's, you know, do you have a story? And certain things that are seen as handicaps elsewhere, you know, that are really talents. Like if you know, come from a family that has a different experience, or is not from a place that's been represented, or if you speak multiple languages, like those are all things that you can bring to your writing that other people don't have. And I think that's just important to keep in mind, is that sometimes what we think are our limitations are really our strengths, and creative writing can help you discover that. Yeah.
Thank you, that was beautiful. Professor Conners?
Yeah, I love all these answers already, and I kind of feel like I don't know, I'll try to add something new, but yeah, with the community, like Professor Holmstrom was saying, I just think the writing community at LaGuardia is so welcoming, so supportive, but then also I think we push each other too, right? I think of faculty and students and everyone just sort of pushes each other to be better, and I think that and to learn more and to grow as writers. I think we help each other grow. And the program itself, I know it's continued to grow, but I think it's because of the people in it, the students, the faculty. But I think part of the community, the way that's been, I guess, manifested is, you know, through the magazine, like that Professor Holmstrom is leading with the Lit, and now it's online, which is even better because more people can access it. And also just the readings, you know, sort of readings that happen at the college, like the readathon and different things, and people get so excited and want to share their work. And I think that energy, right, which is supportive and inclusive, but again, it also is generative. I think that, you know, it makes people want to do more. It makes people want to push themselves even more because they get inspired by one another. So I think that is one of the best things about LaGuardia and about the creative writing program. And I just think that, you know, with so many different stories in the classroom, with whether it's a virtual classroom or in our physical classrooms, whenever we get to go back. I just think that people's minds are opened by hearing from the perspectives of their classmates. And I think that the more that your mind can be opened and the more perspectives that you take in from reading, from hearing from the other students, from hearing from the professors, the more range you will have as a writer, the more, I guess, potential for inspiration, the more complexity with which you look at something, the way that you can observe the world will change because of being inspired by the people in the program. But I just think the community here is so strong, so supportive, and again, just really generative, and that there's great stuff coming out from the student writers. You know, it's every time I teach a creative writing class, I'm just blown away by the work that's produced. It's just, yeah, take the classes, it's magical, you gotta do it.
I love how we're all just talking about how awesome we are. Professor Clark, please.
Okay. I don't want to repeat too much of what's been said. I agree with everything that has been said. This is a really fun conversation. But I think the reason to say it in a slightly different way, the reason to take creative writing at LaGuardia is because you have a story that's important to tell. We want to hear it. Your fellow students want to hear it, and you need to write it. And you need a space where you can grow as a writer and you can learn how to tell your story in the best way possible. And that's in a creative writing class. And I really want to echo what everyone has said about the way the program has grown, which is just amazing over the last several years. Every year there are more and more majors, and we're really shaping the future of literature. New York is the center of the publishing world in the United States. We are right here in the heart of it. And the publishing world is changing. And by taking creative writing classes and honing your skills, you are ready to be part of that transformation. So come on in and, you know, take a seat and share your writing with us. We can't wait to hear it.
Awesome. I'll add it to the echo of awesomeness and say that everyone is right. I feel that the creative writing program at LaGuardia is so supportive. We try really hard to build a community for the faculty, for the students as well. When we were pre-pandemic back in the day, we would have events just to celebrate student writing. We would bring authors, just all sorts of just different spaces to show the college, right, and our community, our local Queens community, what writing looks like at LaGuardia. And so I think one of the reasons that our program keeps growing at LaGuardia is because of our growing visibility of how much our students are shining right in these classes and how much they're gaining from these courses. And so if you're interested in taking a creative writing course or learning more about creative writing or becoming a creative writing major, you can contact me. I'm Dr. Sonia Alejandra Rodriguez. I am the program director, and I can give you all of that wonderful information. So I just want to thank my fellow panelists for being here, for talking about creative writing, your work, your pedagogy. And so thank you so much. Happy National Day on Writing.